Welcome everyone to tonight's online talk, The Midnight Man and the South London Hospital for Women and Children. I'm Antonia, I'm the Museum and Events Coordinator at the Royal College of Nursing, Library and Museum. And this evening's talk is part of our regular public events programme. We also have Lucy from the museum team online this evening who'll be there if there are any queries alongside myself. So before we get started, just a quick bit of housekeeping, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with. Attendees will be on mute throughout the event, so if I could ask you just to stay on mute. You also might like to turn your video off during the talk, as this can improve your connection and reduce bandwidth. If you're having any trouble with Zoom or your connection, try leaving the event and clicking on the link to rejoin, and we'll let you in again. Or if you like, you can message myself or Lucy privately and we'll try to help. And I should say that's Lucy Colbert, just so you have her surname. Just a reminder that the chat is a public forum and everyone can see your comments, and there will be an opportunity to ask Julie questions at the end of the talk. She's going to talk for about 40 minutes. So if I could ask for you to sort of wait towards the end and type your questions in the chat at that point, I'll ask those for you. So without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce Julie Anderson. Julie is a crime fiction writer and author based in Clapham, South London, and this evening she's going to be talking about the fascinating history behind her latest book, The Midnight Man, and this is the first in the Clapham Trilogy of mysteries that she's written, so there's two more to come, all set in South London in the 1940s. Julie's also written a trio of Whitehall thrillers, and the last of these, Opera, was longlisted for the Crime Writers Association Ian Fleming's Steel Dagger Award in 2023. And Julie also writes crime fiction reviews for Time and Leisure magazine and is a co-founder and trustee of the Clapham Book Festival. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Julie.
Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you very much, Antonia, for inviting me, and for everyone for coming along this evening. I'll share my screen if I may. So I've got a presentation with lots of photographs, which include photographs of the South London. So I'll just go into that right now. Where are we? Yeah, that doesn't seem to be working. One moment. This worked when we practiced, but it doesn't seem to be working now. Here we are. I think this is getting rather better. Here we are from the beginning. Can everyone see the slideshow?
No, it hasn't come up, Julie.
It did before.
Yes. Have you clicked on screen, on share and share screen?
Hold on. Apologies, people. This did work before, and I'm not entirely sure why it's not working now. Share screen, select a window. Yeah.
There we go. It's coming up. Oh, it's on the wrong window though, I think.
It's on the wrong window.
Yes.
Bear with me one moment, and I will try and get it to the right window. Here we are, slideshow from the beginning. There, I think that's it. Apologies, ladies and gentlemen.
Julie, sorry, you might need to come out of share and share again. It's still on the wrong wrong window. If you just come out of share and then
share again.
There you go.
There. Is that better?
That's better, yeah.
Excellent. We did practice this and it did work.
It's always the way.
Anyway, as I was saying, thank you very much for inviting me to talk about The Midnight Man and the South London Hospital for Women and Children. Very briefly, a word about me. That's me on the left. I'm a crime fiction writer, and I'm probably best known for the Whitehall Trilogy of books, which are on the right there. The last one of which, as Antonia said, I was fortunate enough to be listed for the Ian Fleming Steel Dagger Award from the Crime Writers Association. But these were contemporary set thrillers, and my new book, The Midnight Man, which is the one that I want to talk to you about and how it intersects with real history, specifically the history of an almost forgotten hospital in South London, is set in 1946. So why the change? I continued to want to write about contemporary issues, but when I started thinking about The Midnight Man, it was back in 2022. We had just come out of COVID. Indeed, we weren't quite aware of how long COVID would continue. And I didn't want to write about the pandemic. But I did want to write about a similar time, a time when there had been a sort of tragic global upheaval, many deaths, and people were incredibly relieved that it was in theory over, but that its ramifications would carry on for years to come. And so I lighted upon the time immediately following the end of World War II, when there was huge joy and relief that the war had finished, followed by austerity and hard times, and people didn't fully understand the impact that the war would have for many, many years to come. And there was also a debate about what to do, whether to try and return to how life was before the war, or whether to change it and to build a new society. As I researched this time, more and more parallels came to the fore, and specifically that this was the time which created a society that I grew up in, which one has seen dismantled in many ways over recent years. And so I began writing The Midnight Man in the end of 2022, set in 1946. But since then, of course, we have had a new government, and perhaps one rather more sympathetic to some of the values of the Attlee government post-World War II. We will see. But that was the when. The question was, where should I set it? And I decided to set it in Clapham, which has been my home for more than 30 years. I know a lot of its history, although a lot of it has changed. I can remember what it was like before, 30 years ago. And much of it, especially those strings of terraced Victorian streets, remains the same. There's a picture there, very atmospheric picture of Clapham Common, and of Clapham South. That's the tube station there, Clapham South Underground, that features in the novel, as does this peculiar building on the right, which I will talk about further on in the talk. But the real focus of the novel, the place where it's set most, is on the left of that road, and that's at a place called the South London Hospital for Women. I used to walk past this every day on my way to catch the tube. And for much of the time, it looked like it did in that photograph. It was had been left to rot, really, a semi-derelict building. It has since been repurposed and turned into various other things. But for the moment, let's have a look at the history of that derelict building on the right there. It was founded, as shown in this early leaflet here, which was published, by the way, in 1943. It was founded in 1912 and was set up as an independent trust. And the South London occupied two buildings on Clapham Common South side, and here they are, Holland House and Kingston House. Now, the one on the left was replaced by a new wing in the 1930s, and the one on the right, the other side next to the chapel, you can see the chapel building there in the middle, continued until the hospital closed. And it bears the crest above the door here that you saw on my previous photograph. The site in Clapham was chosen as the location for the Clapham South London Hospital for Women and Children, because it was on the opposite side of London to the only other institution of its type at the time, which was the New Hospital, which was just off the Euston Road in North London. And it was founded by two remarkable pioneering women surgeons. These were Maud Chadburn and Eleanor Davis Colley. Maud is there on the left in a painting, and that's Eleanor on the right in the photograph. And they were the first in a long line of remarkable women who were associated with the hospital. They were both suffragists and feminists, and Maud her family came from Middlesbrough in the north, but they were living in Kent by the time she went to college. Her father was a Congregationalist minister, and he was said to have denounced his daughter from his pulpit, saying that he would rather that she were dead than join the medical profession. Eleanor, on the right here, was rather more fortunate in that she was the daughter of an existing surgeon, and her father encouraged her to go into the profession. And she eventually, the younger of the two women, became the first woman surgeon to be a member of the Royal College of Surgeons. They met while they were working in the new hospital, the one in North London. It was a small woman-only hospital, and it's now called the Elizabeth Garrett Anderson. You may have heard about it in that name. And there they became partners in work and in life. And they were, amongst with many of their friends, appalled at the lack of provision, medical provision for women to be treated by women. And they were also frustrated at the lack of opportunities for women within the medical profession. At the time, many hospitals would not employ women as doctors or physicians or surgeons, although they would employ them as nurses. Maud and Eleanor decided, with the help of their friends and supporters, people like Harriet Weaver, who was a cousin of Eleanor's, who was the editor of the Free Woman magazine, that they would raise the funds and they would start a hospital of their own in South London. Now, they raised a significant amount of funds, including a very large anonymous donation, totaling some £90,000, which was at the time an absolutely enormous amount. And that was from an anonymous donor, but we will return to that anonymous donor later. So the trust was created in 1912 and the two large houses were purchased, and the hospitals opened its doors in 1913 to women and girls and boys up to the age of 7. It took no male patients, adult male patients at all. Now, at that time, there were 8 other hospitals like this in the UK that admitted, which were women only and had women surgeons, though not exclusively usually. And the plaque on the left here shows that the original building was opened by Princess Louise, the Duchess of Argyll, who was one of the trustees of the original trustees of the hospital. And Her Majesty Queen Mary came to open the second building in 1916. Now, quite a lot of people have speculated that the anonymous donor that really gave such a sum that allowed the hospital to go ahead was indeed a female member of the royal family. And my money's on Queen Mary, but I have no evidence of that. But she continued to be interested in the hospital for most of her life. The deeds, the hospital was set up by a set of deeds of the trust, and those deeds were so tightly drawn that prevented adult males being treated there, and indeed men working there, that during World War I, when the hospital and its founders wanted to help the war effort and to take in male casualties, there had to be an Act of Parliament passed in the House of Commons in order to allow the hospital to take in male patients. And Maud Chadburn, whose photograph you saw earlier, or painting anyway, was actually quite proud of the fact that they'd needed an Act of Parliament in order to waive some of the terms of the original deed of trust. And of course, the deed of trust continued and allowed the hospital to continue in this way, even after the creation of the National Health Service and the Equal Opportunities Act. Because the really unusual thing about this hospital was that it was staffed entirely by women. So from the most senior consultant surgeon down to the lowliest porter and lady serving on the canteen counter, all the staff were women. The hospital engineer was a man, and the hospital accountant who used to come in and do the accounts, and occasionally they had male volunteers helping in the garden, but otherwise only women. And I've spoken with some of the people who used to work there in the 70s and 80s, and they say that there was a very unique spirit in the SLH, the South London, and ethos, because of the fact that it was women only. Several people used the phrase that there were fewer egos competing for attention, and a lot more pleasant spirit. So, for example, all staff ate together in the staff canteen. There were no consultants' dining rooms. It was all in one place. And it's instructive. It was instructive to me to find, when I was doing my research, I read a lot of the minutes of the management board meetings of this hospital, and for some context, other hospitals in South London and indeed North London. And immediately post-war, there was a huge shortage of nursing staff. And you can see it in the minutes of all the other hospitals. It's not mentioned once in the SLH minutes, because they never had problems recruiting nurses or doctors, because women wanted to work there. I think that's testament of what a good place it was. Now, by the 1940s, and these are pages from that booklet that you saw earlier, by the 1940s, when this booklet was published, there were still only 4 hospitals in London which employed women as doctors or surgeons. And all the gynecological wards with consultants had consultants who were exclusively male. Some medical men claimed that there was no need or indeed a desire for there to be any women doctors. And Maud, and this is the quote I'm going to give you from this booklet here, said this: "It is not claimed that all women want women doctors, but that there is the desire for women doctors, that it exists, and among women of all classes, is shown by the amazing expansion in the SLH's services, the great distances from which many of its patients are prepared to travel, by its long waiting lists and huge army of supporters." Now, the SLH was a general hospital, and it provided comprehensive medical care of all types, excluding only acute infectious fevers and mental diseases. So it had all the usual hospital departments: ENT, ophthalmic, orthopedic, urological, etc., skin, pathological, X-ray, electrical, and with a special radium clinic for the treatment of cancers in women, and a special ward for diabetes. In 1934, the total number of medical cases reached 794, and there were over 1,700 operations performed of 208 different types. And at 224 beds, the SLH was the largest hospital, certainly in the UK and probably in the world, staffed only by women. Now, here's a picture of it in the 1930s. There's the old building on the right of the earlier photograph, and the other larger building has been replaced by this new wing here. It was built in the 1930s, designed by Sir Edwin Cooper, and it's in that building that most of my book takes place. And on the right here, you have a picture of the dining room that I was telling you about, the one single staff canteen, rather than a staff canteen and a consultant's dining rooms. And that is very much the centre of events where my book takes place. Largely, I have to say, because I have no medical background. I am not a doctor or a nurse, and it would have been quite difficult for me to write about medical things and make sure I got them right. But I wanted a place that wasn't necessarily a medical specialist place, but it was also a hub where people from across the hospitals, nurses, doctors, ancillary staff would all come together. And I lit upon the idea of using the hospital canteen to be the centre, if you like, of my book. And one of the main characters is actually the manageress of the canteen. More photographs of the old hospital. These are all courtesy of Lambeth Archives, who the people there were just tremendous when I was doing this research for the book. Here is a rear view of the hospital. These are the award-winning gardens. Unfortunately, now a Tesco's car park. And this is the roof of the midwives building, because the old SLH had a midwifery school and trained many midwives from all over England, but also from the Commonwealth, training a lot of people from Africa and the Indian subcontinent. On the right, you can see the outpatients department. The SLH never had an accident and emergency. If there were patients in ambulances that needed emergency treatment, they were taken to St George's, Tooting, or St Thomas's on the river. But they did have a regular outpatients department, and you see a picture of it there. Now, the SLH continued providing health services both to local people and to women who came often, as that quote from Maud illustrates, from a long way away, sometimes from outside the country. But eventually, the local health authority closed the hospital on grounds they claimed of cost efficiency, a reason which still prompts angry denunciations today from those who were working there at the time. And there was a huge local protest, as you can see in that picture on the left there, and a work-in. The protest was conducted by nurses, doctors, and former patients. And indeed, for some time, service provision was continued. The nurses continued to provide, excuse me, healthcare. It became quite a sort of cause célèbre for the women's movement, and you had people come from Greenham Common. If those of you of a certain age may remember the peace camp at Greenham Common in the 1980s, the Greenham women came, and a lot of women came from the Commonwealth. Many of those who had trained as midwives and nurses from India and Africa came to support their fellow nurses. There was a local petition that gained many thousands of signatures, which was presented to number 10 Downing Street. Unfortunately, it eventually did close, and another battle commenced, this time to see who, either the trust or the local area health authority, should get the proceeds from the sale of the land and the buildings. Now, this was when I first came across the buildings, the photograph on the right, which essentially is a boarded up and derelict hospital. But it has been repurposed, and I now shop in the Tesco's, which is on the ground floor. However, it was when I was looking around for a setting for my novel that I thought about the hospital, and particularly I thought about those two plaques that you saw earlier, one from Princess Louise, Duchess of Argyll, and one Queen Mary opening the hospital. And it occurred to me that it would be an excellent location for my novel. This struck me as particularly pertinent at that very time, 1946, because if you think about it, women had essentially run things at home while the men had been away at war for the last 5 or 6 years. Many of them had enjoyed responsibilities and freedoms that would otherwise have been denied them. And yet they were expected, once the war was over, to return to their traditional roles. Now, some of them undoubtedly welcomed a return to the domestic sphere, but others did not. And at the SLH at that time, the opposite was happening. So the male doctors who'd been working there were leaving to be replaced by female doctors, and the male patients were leaving, and it became a woman-only hospital again. And that sort of tension is exactly the sort of tension that appeals to writers like me, because that means that there will be drama, and that means that it'll be worth writing about. It's quite interesting. A reader of the book actually wrote to me and said that she had a great aunt who worked during the war in a munitions factory. And before she died, she'd spoken to the reader of the book, who said that for the first time in her life during the Second World War, this lady had actually earned her own money. She had a degree of independence that she had never enjoyed before, because she was totally dependent on her husband. The reader said to me that, she said, you've got it right. She said, this was the first independence that many of these women had, and the men didn't like it, she said, which I'm sure probably was in certain elements, certain relationships would have been the case. So not all of the women wanted to go back to the kitchen, to home and hearth. But as I say, the opposite was happening in the SLH. But the SLH had to prove themselves, I think, from almost the beginning, with many people deciding that actually this was not necessary to have a woman-only hospital staffed and run by women, as well as taking women. It was also a very interesting time, I think, in terms of medicine and in terms of the NHS. We have the NHS Act, which was passed on the 6th of November 1946. And indeed, in the novel, there is a party because the nurses want to celebrate the fact that the NHS is now going to come into being. And I'm sure I don't need to tell people, but I mean, what that meant was that in 1948, 2 years later, what we ended up with was universal, free at the point of use medical treatment. And until that time, if you couldn't pay, you weren't sure of getting treatment. And I wanted that to come out in the novel as well. So there were some diseases which were rife and completely incurable, like tuberculosis, for example, and one of my characters suffers from TB. And strangely enough, when I was doing some of the research into that disease for the book, I found the parallels with COVID, which I had been trying to escape from in writing about this period. Of course, we developed antibiotics very soon after 1946. In fact, there was the streptomycin trial during 45 and 46, and 46 in the hospitals in South London. Now, I don't know whether the South London took part in that trial. It was run out of a hospital in Chelsea. So it could indeed have done so, but it certainly does in my novel. And here's something that I've really included because I think it's a wonderful thing, which is the booklet that was issued to all households in 1948. This is a facsimile, and it appears in the second book in my trilogy, because this is when the National Health Service actually started to come into being. And I'll read that little bit there, which I think is a wonderful manifesto. And it says, everyone, rich or poor, man, woman or child, can use it or any part of it. There are no charges except for a few special items. There are no insurance qualifications, but it is not a charity. You are all paying for it, mainly as taxpayers, and it will relieve your money worries in times of illness. And I think it was important to say that there were no insurance qualifications, because insurance was the only way that you could get any sort of health cover for most people at the time. And of course, a lot of people couldn't afford insurance, or if they could only insure the man in the family, because the man was the person who went out and earned money. So there was inbuilt discrimination against women and children, even in something like that. And that was done away with when the National Health Service was introduced. Now, I also want to mention the fact that it was that my book is set in winter 1946, and I think this is particularly relevant because it was then the coldest winter. 46-47 was the coldest winter then on record. Whenever we get too much snow and you see the news bulletins and they show you clips of old-fashioned steam trains having to forge through huge snow mounds, that's likely to be film from 1946-7, the winter of 46-7. And one of my characters overhears, when she's freezing in her bedroom, an altercation outside, and subsequently a nurse is found dead. But the character doesn't want to open the window because it's too cold. Now she goes to the police and her evidence is dismissed by them. But she is determined she's right. And bear in mind, these are women who are used to having to do things for themselves because that's what they've been doing for the past 6 years when the men had all been away at war. So they decide that they're going to investigate. And their investigations eventually centre on the hospital and a man who had a midnight assignation with the nurse, hence the title, The Midnight Man. Now, it's set not just in the hospital, but also in the area around Clapham South. And if any of you know South London, you may know this area. This is a modern photograph here. That is still the tube at Clapham South. That's where I used to get the underground every morning. And this building above it is Westbury Court, which would have been a new building at that stage. It was built in the 1930s. And it would have been exclusively council flats, although some of them, of course, now have been sold off and are in private ownership. The building on the right is the Odeon, which is also still there. You can actually see it in this photograph here on the left, just there. But it is now, it's actually a wine warehouse. It's a majestic wine warehouse. Other wine warehouses are available, as they say. And my characters go there to see a new film. In fact, the Royal Command film for that year, which was Powell and Pressburger's A Matter of Life and Death, with David Niven. And Cinema Gang was mass entertainment then, and people went once, twice, or sometimes 3 times a week. And that features in all 3 of the books. The other building which features was the one that I showed you right at the beginning, which is a rather somewhat odd building just on the edge of the common. And it's still there today. This is it, rather unloved and unlovely with graffiti and so on, as compared with the 1940s when it's very smart and new. And these are the entrance to the deep shelters at Clapham South. And the story of these shelters is interesting in themselves. It starts in Spain in the Spanish Civil War, where the sort of carpet bombing was first from the air was first experienced when the Luftwaffe bombed Barcelona, Madrid, and most memorably Guernica. And the Spanish brigaders who came back to England once the Civil War was lost to Franco, the international brigaders came back, and they were vociferous in trying to bring to the attention of the government what they had experienced, saying that if there was going to be war, that was the sort of war it was going to be. It was going to be war from the air. And they asked for deep shelters to be built in all the cities. Now, they were taken little notice of. And indeed, once war was declared and the Blitz began, many people started using the underground as their shelters. And people will have seen the Henry Moore paintings of the sleepers and photographs of life, people sleeping on the platforms of the underground. However, there was a direct hit in early 1940 on Bank Station because many of these stations simply weren't deep enough to protect people. And 56 people died in that direct hit, and many, many more were wounded. And the government realised that actually they did have to do something. And so they started the construction of these super deep shelters that were beneath the existing tube lines. They were completed too late for the Blitz, but they did come into their own in 1944 when there were the V1 and V2 rocket attacks. And South Londoners would descend nightly in the lifts to their bunk spaces in the shelters deep below. And there was a whole mini city down there with canteens, lavatories, washrooms, and a medical centre with services provided by the South London Hospital for Women, which was just on the other side of the road. Now, these shelters still exist, and in fact, if anyone is in London and wants to see one of them, I suggest that they go on to the London Transport Museum website, because they do hidden history tours of the deep shelters on a regular basis. One thing to mention, however, is that the lifts no longer work, so you have to go down and unfortunately back up 180 stairs in order to go through them. But it was quite a sociable place, apparently. People played music, sang songs as the rockets fell overhead. There was even dancing, and we know from graffiti found on the walls there was some romance as well. And all this took place as the underground trains rumbled overhead, because they were deeper than the underground lines. It must have been quite difficult to get any sleep, I would have thought. But people did have an entire alternative existence down there. Now, getting back to the SLH, what happened after the closure of the hospital itself? Well, the building was sold off, and it is now an apartment block with a very large Tesco's on the ground floor, where I do my shopping once a week. And behind it, where you saw the gardens, is now the Tesco's car park. The road leading to the car park is actually named after Maud Chadbourne. It's called Maud Chadbourne Place. But the other memories or legacies, if you like, of the founders and of the hospital are fewer and far further between. Eleanor died at the age of 60 in 1934 of thyroid toxemia. And Maud died 23 years later in 1957, aged 89, in somewhat straitened circumstances. There is the Eleanor Davis Colley Lecture Theatre at the Royal College of Surgeons, which was opened in 2004 after a big fundraising campaign. But that is now closed because the Royal College of Surgeons headquarters has been refurbished, and that has not been reopened. There is also the Chadbourne Academic Clinical Lectureships that exist today and are advertised in BMJ and other medical journals to enable people, not exclusively women, but they tend to be women, people who have specific caring responsibilities and who therefore cannot work for a full-time lectureship. This enables them to advance their clinical and academic careers. What I found, and what slightly was annoying me as someone who was doing research, but also I found really quite scandalous, is that there are no biographies of either founder or of any of the women involved later in the hospital, and there were many and remarkable ones, or of the South London Hospital for Women and Children itself. And given that it must have touched the lives of thousands and thousands of women and children during its lifetime, I'm very surprised that has not happened and people haven't written it. I hope that my little crime thriller, or three of them, does to an extent give some extended life to the hospital and keep its memory alive. The Midnight Man is the first book in a trilogy. They're all set immediately post World War II, and they all intersect with real places and history. The second, which follows many of the same characters, is being edited now, and it takes place over August Bank Holiday weekend in 1948. The third takes place in spring 1951 and is called Festival Days. And for those of you who perhaps can recall it, the Festival of Britain happened in spring 1951. I've got this in because my publisher wouldn't let me get away with not putting it in, which is telling you that the reception for The Midnight Man so far has been, it's been very well received, and lots of writers who I admire have said very nice things about it. And that's it. It's available in ebook, it's available in paperback, and also an audiobook read by Annabel Dowler. And if any of you listen to The Archers, that's Kirsty in The Archers. Incidentally, if any of you are local and would be interested, I'll be leading a literary walk around Clapham Common on the 12th of October as part of this year's Clapham Book Festival. So if you are interested in doing that and you live in London, check that out on the website of the book festival, and I can send you the email of that tomorrow after when there's the feedback and so on. Right. Well, thank you for listening. I hope I have interested you and not bored you. And I'm going to stop sharing now and take any questions that you may have.
Thank you ever so much, everyone, for contributing those. We'll sort of save the chat and share that with Julie as well, because I know it's tricky for her to read as we're talking. And we also will send out an email tomorrow, which will go to all of you, which will have those links about Julie's books, and also a link to our evaluation form. And it'd be really helpful. They only take about a minute to fill out. It'd be really fantastic if you could take a moment just to fill out the form and let us know what you thought. And yeah, we've got lots of other events coming up as well over the next few months. So hope to see you at some of those. But on that note, I will draw things to a close and just say thank you again, Julie, for a wonderful talk. I would thoroughly recommend Julie's book. It's a really great read, and you really do learn such a lot about the history of the South London. Julie's also written a blog post for the RCN news page, and we'll share the link to that, which has some of the historical information that Julie's been talking about tonight. So thank you again for taking the time to join us this evening. It's been great to see you all.